that I am in control. I have the power to make you surrender.
Big budget movies aren't made out of pure love. There's often influences on the business side of things that will shape the project, primarily financial concerns. And thus we see a phenomenon of films being released before they are ready and various installments of a franchise being done like clockwork. Studios love something as consistent in both entertainment value and revenue as the James Bond series, and so the franchise became a beloved cash cow, a notable point in whatever game was being played between companies at the time, and that is still happening now. For many years, United Artists and MGM had been struggling to compete in the marketplace, and their main asset was 007. It seemed like the studios changed heads just before each new production. Some of those heads would leave Cubby Broccoli and Eon alone, while others insisted on getting more involved. For the most part, Cubby and the crew managed to let that not affect the quality of the production as much as possible. Now with Cubby's declining health, and the leadership having been transferred over to Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, the two now face their first real confrontation in this arena. And after one of the most troubled and rushed productions in the series' history, Tomorrow Never Dies was remarkably released in December of 1997. Unfortunately, it came out the same day in the US as James Cameron's Titanic, and thus it became the only Brosnan Bond film not to open at number 1 at the box office, and showcased a notable downgrade from GoldenEye in the estimation of both fans and critics. A British warship is sighted off the coast by 2 Chinese MiGs. Both sides think they are in safe territory and that the other is violating international maritime law. Turns out, both sides are mistaken due to the work of a techno-terrorist in the employ of a media mogul named Elliot Carver, who orders the sinking of the ship and the destruction of one of the MiGs. When the warship is sunk, the British Admiralty retaliates and starts sending the fleet to China. James Bond is ordered to investigate Carver based on a mysterious signal picked up during the attack being traced to one of his satellites. Upon arriving at a party in Germany meant to celebrate Carver's public success, Bond encounters 2 women who will be essential to his investigation. The first is an old flame of his named Paris, who is now married to Elliot. The second turns out to be a Chinese agent named Wei Lin. With only 48 hours to go before the confrontation between the British and Chinese fleets, Bond will have to work fast to link Carver to the incident and prevent a disaster that will have global ramifications. Tomorrow Never Dies is a victim of circumstance. The script was being rewritten constantly, with new pages coming in on the morning of shooting any one particular scene. The director clashed with the producers on quite a few occasions, and filming wrapped on September 5th, a little over 3 months from its worldwide premiere date. As far as the box office numbers go, no one expected Titanic to be the moneymaker it was. And who would have guessed that the sequel to GoldenEye would have played second fiddle to a historical romantic drama from the guy who launched Arnold Schwarzenegger into the public consciousness? A lot of the fan complaints I've heard seem to stem from 2 sources. The film is very safe and predictable, and the film is very high octane, with 2 separate action scenes being separated by only a 2-minute break. For some, the slower-paced intrigue and elegance of the classic Bond films are gone, replaced by the fast-paced franticness of 90s action films. The movie is tripping over itself at times to make sure that the audience's pulse is consistently over 120 beats per minute. It reminds me of the reason I don't care for most musicals. There's an overabundance of songs, and so the whole thing feels like a concert, versus telling a story with some musical numbers only to highlight the most important scenes and emotional moments. Here, the quieter talking scenes and exposition beats feel like they are taking a backseat to the action, only there to facilitate what we all really came to see, which apparently is Bond running and shooting people with some vehicle set pieces and Bond theme blaring away as often as possible. I'm gonna be honest here. If that's not something that sounds like it would be an entertaining way to spend part of an afternoon, then Tomorrow Never Dies probably isn't your bag. Me, though, I'm very open to this, as I don't have too many strict criteria on what a Bond film has to do or include in order to make a rewatch of it into my schedule for the day. As long as the movie features a leading man called James Bond who has a sense of style about himself, has a fine leading lady to accompany him, foils a devious bad guy, and there are some fun action scenes throughout, I'm not too picky if a film decides not to strive to be much more than that. It's certainly welcome, but it's also fine if a Bond film just wants to do the standard Bond formula as long as it does it well. Tomorrow Never Dies has always been a blast for me, though an often superficial one that doesn't take advantage of the brilliant film lying underneath its surface. I've never not had a good time with the flick, and while it's not one of my favorites, it's a high-flying James Bond-coded party that I'm down to attend for a couple of hours, even if I would prefer some substance at the expense of an action scene or two. Perhaps the thing that has aged the best about the film is the actual plot. A well-known media figure having this much power to influence governments and people to the point of war may have seemed silly and far-fetched at one time, despite several prominent examples of this throughout history, but given our life-sustaining reliance on technology and our obsession with global events these days, it feels like an oddly prophetic and timeless notion. Sure, the film is quaint in featuring a heavy emphasis on the traditional newspapers and magazines as means of communication, but those are just some of the artillery that Carver uses in his media army. I'm sure if this film were made today that the internet and social media would replace them. It may still seem like a superfluous tool for a Bond villain to use in his worldwide domination, especially with how people use those tools, like on TikTok and Instagram, but it's a frightening prospect if you really think about it. Our online access has fundamentally changed us as a society, even if you don't opt into using technology much, though I would question how you're listening to this review without it, and it's a powerful resource that world leaders, political candidates, and celebrities take advantage of to frightening effect. In this way, Tomorrow Never Dies may have aged the best in the series, though I highly doubt that even Barbara and Michael had that much foresight in their creative planning for this film. It seems like more of an unintentional happenstance. Pierce Brosnan continues the good work with the character he did in GoldenEye. He's got the role down, and it's a joy to watch him have a lot of fun with the character while still bringing some creativity to his take. Here, the main emotional points Brosnan gets to play is with Terry Hatcher's Paris Carver. I love the idea of Bond coming across a former flame that meant something to him, as it's a refreshing change of pace from the rotating door of leading ladies. However, this probably would have been more impactful if Paris was someone we also knew from the past. Brosnan and Hatcher do what they can to sell this relationship, but because we're not on the same page as Bond as to how important this relationship was to him, and because the film almost seems to forget about her afterward, it does not have the resonance it should. It's a missed opportunity, and I'd hate to think the notion was wasted with this one chance. It's not that it's badly executed during the time the film takes to focus on it, it's just that it could have been so much more. I do like that Bond takes a moment to say goodbye to her after killing Kaufman, and that he brings her up again to Carver when he next sees him. But there should be a bit more here, especially after the series did such a good job with Bond and a former friend in the last film. I know these filmmakers are capable of so much more. Michelle Yeoh's Wei Lin is a very popular and memorable Bond woman. Part of that is because this was the international breakthrough part for Yeoh, who has become one of the most respected and prolific actresses in history. Part of that is because she is given plenty of opportunities within the film to hold her own, and she doesn't have much time to be visually exploited for her sexuality, which helps give the character more standing with a lot of audiences. On the surface, it's clear why she's in the conversation about the best women of the series. I have some issues with her. I think because we are focusing so much on Bond's side of the investigation, Wei Lin seems to come out of nowhere in the second half when we see her at the Devonshire wreck. Seriously, Bond had to recapture the GPS encoder and have an expert work on it before he could find the wreck. So how did she find it? My second problem is that I don't buy the romance angle. They don't have enough downtime to flirt or build a relationship to make this work. Michelle and Pierce just don't have the natural chemistry to sell me on something deeper. Much like the filmmakers do in Quantum of Solace with Camille, I wish Wei Lin and Bond would forgo the romantic relationship in favor of just being colleagues. The action scene with her in the bike shop is my big low point of the film. It feels very obligatory. We have a great martial artist-inclined actress, so let's utilize those skills. It also comes just after an extended sequence where she and Bond escaped Carver on a motorbike, so it interrupts the pace and feels like an unneeded extension in the action department. Beyond that, I think the bickering can get a little one-note quickly, But I still think Wei Lin earns her place amongst the pantheon of great Bond women. She doesn't annoyingly try to upstage Bond throughout, so there's room for both her and Bond to have the spotlight. After the bickering is done, they feel like reasonable agents working together for a common goal, though I'm not a fan of her getting captured twice, and it's great to see a more action-focused companion this time out. Wei Lin's light has been somewhat diminished in recent years, but I'm not surprised she still tends to be a favorite, and I'm inclined to mostly agree. Elliot Carver is played by Sir Jonathan Pryce, in yet another role that was designed for Sir Anthony Hopkins. Pryce makes the character his own by making him a right bastard that's very colorful. A media mogul character lends itself to a theatrical performance, and Carver feels like a larger-than-life character that rightly makes a living in presentation and media. He may be a little too campy for some, but A, there are plenty of Bond villains in the past who have had a sense of camp about them, and B, I don't feel like these moments take away from his threat. Sentencing his wife to die is a very cold act, but it's complemented with a short shot where we see Carver taking a moment to himself. I read this as him coming to terms with this decision. Later, before he responds to Bond's jab about Paris and Saigon, we see him pause. The way I read these two bits together, losing Paris is a personal blow to him, but a necessary one for his ambitions, and thus we have solid evidence of Carver's lack of value in human life. I think seeing something beneath the surface is important for a villain, and I applaud the filmmakers for keeping that in mind. He's a really fun presence here and a much appreciated bright spot. As I explained, I think the Paris storyline isn't carried through to its fullest potential. I don't think I can pin this squarely on Terry Hatcher, though. She's a little mundane in her acting choices, but she's matching Pierce and her intensity to make me believe the history between these two, and it's a complicated one. She clearly misses him and holds a lot of fondness, but feels enough anger to have still searched for his obituary after his departure. That's a hard line to walk for an actress, and she performs it well enough. Though I do have to wonder what it would have been like if we managed to get Monica Bellucci in the part like Pierce wanted, or if we had a returning actress from one of the other films, but oh well. She's a fair addition to the cast. I'm not too keen on the henchmen here, with one exception. I think both Stamper and Gupta are casualties of the film's running time. Roger Spottiswoode wanted to make sure the picture was under 2 hours, and I think this desire turned into both a blessing and a curse. The film feels very tight, and I love a lot of the pacing, but it does mean that sequences that were meant to give these two some character were cut, and sometimes undeservedly so. Both men are functional but given little polish. Stamper fares a bit better thanks to his stamina against pain and his idolization of Kaufman, but not by much, and I've never understood where fans are coming from that want to place him towards the top of the pile. Neither are awful, but I'm not seeing what gives them an edge over so many other great characters from the past. The exception I mentioned is Dr. Kaufman. Much like Pryce with his eccentricity, Vincent Schiavelli infuses the bit part with a personality that's a hoot to have around. It's a sick and twisted part, but it also has some of the fun of the great roles of the past, like Fiona Volpe or Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, so the whole scene becomes a highlight for me. There's a great tension underneath, and I love how it ends. Bond's cold dispatch of a villain is always great, but remember that the woman on the news tape said that there was an unidentified man with a self-inflicted gunshot to the head. Well, Bond made sure the media didn't lie to you. Bravo. I'm amazed that Roger Spottiswoode made something competent here, much less a cohesive and comprehensible entry as this one is. I didn't learn about the troubled production until much later in life, and I was shocked as I don't think the film gives this away much. Beyond the odd ADR here, the occasional glossed over beat of story, and a lack of character development, this feels like any other standard Bond film that was given a fair amount of time of gestation. The high production value is apparent. The film doesn't feel too sloppy in its editing, and the performances and action all seem to be held to professional standards. I do think the script is unbalanced, and that the picture is skewed further to the visually stimulating side in place of some much-needed downtime, so it feels like candy to me. Something that is initially very tasty and appeals to an audience's expectations, it should not be a consistent substitute for the meatier films, but as an occasional treat, it's a great thing to have. While the spacing between the scenes themselves could be stretched out a bit more, the action itself is generally pretty excellent. It's all filled with a layer of cheese, but I kind of love both the structured and the cheap when it comes to my thrills, as having a balance between both makes a movie feel more alive and like it's inviting us to have fun, much like Guy Hamilton set forth as his mandate when he made Goldfinger. The opening sequence is balls-to-the-wall action with a lot more explosions than your average Bond pre-titles, but the tension is great throughout, and I adore seeing Brosnan in action. Other highlights include the escape from the printing press, the BMW sequence in the car park, which is my favorite sequence in the whole film, the motorbike chase through the streets of Saigon, and the finale. When action is done this well, I'm torn when I feel like there's one sequence too many, as I've definitely seen plenty of action films where it takes too long to get going, and once it does, it's not as good as the wait would demand. So I guess I'll take a couple of lackluster bits just so I can have these other great set pieces. The most notable change from the last film for me is the music. David Arnold steps up to the podium, and my goodness, he delivers a home run here. A longtime Bond fan, Arnold shows off his talents and adoration of John Barry's legacy in bombastic glory. Originally, Barry was being talked to about returning for this one, and while I would have loved to have seen him tackle a Brosnan film, I'm so used to Arnold's style for these films that I have a hard time imagining them with a different musical sound. Arnold composed his own submission for the title song, which we'll get to in a minute, and he uses it beautifully as a recurring theme throughout. Much like Barry's best efforts, the song is used in regular rotation along with the Bond theme for a much-needed shine throughout. This is a very exciting score, perfectly executing what the producers hoped for with Eric Serra's offering for GoldenEye, a contemporary effort with a modernized respect and emulation of the past. Fun fact, this is one of 3 Bond scores that were nominated for the American Film Institute's list of greatest film scores ever made that was compiled back in 2005. The other 2 were Goldfinger and Casino Royale from 1967. I do think there's enough instances of the Bond theme here to cover 3 movies, but I've been so frustrated with the lack of the Bond theme in many of the more recent scores that I'm willing to just go with it here. I also like both of the vocal songs. Sheryl Crow's Tomorrow Never Dies isn't for everyone, but I like how melancholy the tune is and how thought-provoking it can be with its lyrics. Of course, that all seems like a moot point when it's coupled with the standout Surrender by Katie Lang. There's a number of songs we know that were composed and rejected for this film, but this is the one that hurts the most, as it's nearly perfect for James Bond. The muted and screeching horns, the great and seductive tune, and Lang's powerful performance bringing back fond memories of both Shirley Bassey and Tom Jones, I feel like it was such a mistake to place this at the end credits solely. Include both songs for sure, but this, more than any other number, deserves to be placed at the front of a Bond film. All in all, Tomorrow Never Dies' music is a fantastic high point for the series, and Arnold was rightly kept on for 4 more films. Despite my comments earlier about some aspects and story points being ahead of their time, I don't want to give the impression that this film is greater than most Bond films for me. There are a number of other things I haven't mentioned yet that bug me about the film. First, I think the Ministry is a little too trigger-happy about sending the entire fleet to China without trying to have some real dialogue. It makes it seem like the British are willing to throw out years of carefully laid diplomatic ties to China based on one large and odd catastrophe. I get that there's pressure from the masses, but I would hope our world leaders might try to exercise a little restraint and look at a few avenues before hitting the nuclear option. Though I guess depending on your view of current politicians, this might not be that big of a stretch. Shipping Q out to Hamburg seems like it's the same problem that we've had in many of the Roger Moore films. Why would the head of an entire section based in London be flown out for a 5-minute gadget briefing? But the real excuse is because Desmond Llewellyn is so much fun, and it'd be a shame not to use him while you have him. Cards on the table, this is my favorite scene of his in the Brosnan era. Bond's conversation with Carver at the party about the Devonshire always seemed too brazen and on the nose for a spy. I get that he doesn't have a lot of time to operate, but I feel like he's just inviting Carver to engage him when he doesn't have a lot of concrete information to act on yet. I love bringing back characters that aren't MI6 regulars, but Jack Wade adds so little to the film that I'm surprised he gets billing over Götz Otto and Ricky Jay. General Chang turns out to be a big part of the scheme, so it's surprising we only get one shot of him in the film. I think he was added in order to strengthen Wei Lin's story, and I think that's a fine addition, but it gets treated almost like an afterthought. It also seems strange that Carver doesn't change much about his operation once Bond and Wei Lin have escaped and had time to inform the governments. I think he feels a little too secure in the presumed infallibility of his plan. I know he gives his reasons as to why, but I would be a bit more concerned if both China and Britain had any reason to suspect me of foul play. There's a few more things I'd like to point out. This is the first time since Spy that we've seen Bond wearing his formal naval suit. It's easy to forget about Bond's military background, so I appreciate getting to see him wear it here. This is also the first appearance of the Walther P99 in a Bond film. While I love the PPK, I have a similar love for the P99, and it's one of the few things that survived the hard reboot transition from Die Another Day to Casino Royale. The phone is one of my favorite gadgets in the series. It's got multiple applications, and I love that Bond has to be clever in how to use it. Several times in the series, a gadget only has the one function, and it can be pretty obvious what the exact situation will be where Bond has to use it. This is up there with the briefcase in From Russia with Love on my personal list. Finally, there's a quick line that Carver says to Bond.
The distance between insanity and genius is measured only by success.
When I went to high school, we had a monthly newspaper that would sometimes include inspirational quotes on the back. This line was included and attributed to Bruce Fierstein, and I remember feeling like it was pretty obvious that whoever added it had either never seen the film or was having a bit of a laugh. Though I can tell you from personal experience, none of the people I knew at the high school, which was just over 120 kids, and some of my friends being editors on that paper, were big Bond fans. It's a lot like when I hear people quote Polonius from Hamlet, "To thine own self be true," as a motivational quote. It's ironic given the deliverer of the line. Tomorrow Never Dies is the equivalent of a pepperoni pizza to me. It's exactly what I think of when I think of James Bond, and while there are more tasty alternatives, it contains everything I want in a 007 film and does it with the required panache. It's a perfect example of how a less than stellar James Bond film is still way ahead of the competition when it comes to action films. It stumbles and falls at times, but it's so good in other places, and I'm generally pleased with the viewing because I'm getting exactly what I hoped for. A charismatic leading man, a fun and dastardly villain, beautiful and interesting women, remarkable action scenes, enough story meat to chew on, a wonderful helping of style and execution, great music, and a smile plastered over my face when it's over. I'm sorry to hear the production was a literal nightmare, but if it's any consolation, this is one of my most viewed films in the series, and I think it's a perfectly fine entry. In the aftermath of the turmoil of the production, Tomorrow Never Dies ultimately did about as well as GoldenEye in box office numbers, and the crew knew they had a good thing going. After a bold reintroduction and a subsequent more standardized offering, I imagine the filmmakers were eager to try something different with Brosnan's third film to close out the millennium. And like so many other third films in the series, The World Is Not Enough is the monument of Brosnan's tenure, representing much of what the public thinks of when they remember his era, for better or for worse.